My name is Frank Boring from Grand Valley State University, and this interview is for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project at Grand Valley. If we could begin with, what is your name and where and when were you born?
My name is Michael J. Smith, and I'm originally from Bogota, New Jersey, small haven outside New York City.
And what was your early childhood like?
Well, it started in 1953 when I was born, and my childhood was great. I lived in a very small town. My dad was the chief of police. My mom was everything from a cafeteria worker to eventually the vice president of the bank in town. I had an older brother and an older sister and a younger sister. We went to local Catholic school, and then we went to private high schools. And I would say it was very uneventful yet fulfilling. We had the excitement of New York City for those big time events. For family, we would go to Radio City for the new shows, etc. But mostly we played in our backyard and played with other kids in the neighborhood, went to summer programs with other kids in town, recreation programs, and pretty much stayed in the area, really.
I was born in '54, went to Catholic school, then to a private school. So as I was growing up, and I can now picture you're just a year ahead of me, one of the things that influenced me was the music. What kind of music did you listen to as you were growing up from your parents and then from there on?
Well, it's kind of funny because music in my house was a big deal, but only because my brother, who was a little bit older than me, was a rock and roll fanatic, and I just got sort of leftover music choices. But my parents were big into Broadway shows, so my influence was more smoother music than the hard rock. I would have to go with my brother into the city to get tickets to Fillmore East, which was, yes, a big deal at that point. But I was content to go to see Hair with tickets that my parents gave me for Christmas, actually. So very divergent. But I love music, and I always was a good listener.
Were you interested at all with the world around you as a child? I know that my father had Time magazine, there was a subscription, there was news, of course, the radio. We didn't have television at that time, but how did you know what was going on around you?
Well, I think because of my education, I learned more about what was going on in the real world. But really, my grammar school and high school singular focus was mostly about where I was. I went to an all-boys Catholic high school, and it was all about competition and the next step, getting into a great college, whatever. And again, my folks were both from that town and grew up there, so our reach was not very far.
As we got into high school, there was something you couldn't avoid, and that was that there was a conflict going on overseas. How aware were you of the Vietnam conflict as you were entering into high school and getting through high school?
I was very aware of the Vietnam conflict really through my father, who was a Navy veteran himself. So he had strong opinions on everything that was in the press and the reasons why we were there or shouldn't be there. And then really he influenced our choices as we looked to next steps for college. And funny enough, his influence pointed my brother in the direction of West Point, where my brother graduated from, and he chose a smoother, softer side for me and thought I should go to the Naval Academy. And it was only because of his interest really in the world around him and his experience that I looked at the service at all.
But Mike, unlike today, there was a draft. And that had to have had some, you were old enough at that point to recognize that you could be called up and go somewhere.
Right.
So what was the,
Well, it was sort of like a cloud because even while my brother was at West Point, and again, he was 3 years in grade older than me, he had a number. And I had a number also, but physically I was already at the Coast Guard Academy when my number was pulled and we were already in peace terms because my college experience at the academy, the Coast Guard Academy, was from 71 to 75. And so I was really pulled into the reality of what does that mean because my brother was worried about graduating from West Point, the United States Military Academy, and going right to war. He didn't have to do that, but that was a home discussion.
okay, so now I'm getting a better idea. I'll tell you later what my experience was too, somewhat similar. So we kind of answered the question that I wanted to get, which were you aware of Vietnam? So let's go back then to this decision. Your father's pretty much guiding you and your brother in terms of where to go. So how did Coast Guard come up out of all this?
Well, my brother and I were pretty smart in high school, so we were in an honors class. And my father jokingly said, you know, you can go any place you want for college as long as it begins with U.S. So that meant the United States Naval Academy, the Military Academy, the Air Force Academy, the Merchant Marine Academy. So we looked at other colleges, of course. But when my brother entered into the interest level of West Point, we lived close enough to West Point to go see it several times. His turned into a political journey because only by political appointment could you go to the United States Military Academy and the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy and the Merchant Marine Academy. So he started that interest, and at that point in time, certain congressmen and certain senators had a number of appointments, but they could only have a certain number at a certain academy of which they were prompting or promoting. My brother took competitive tests, and my brother was in the top of his class. So he got in supported by a political nomination. Because my brother was already at West Point, I wanted something different. I had gone to West Point routinely to visit him, and quite frankly, gray is not my favorite color. And everything was gray. The buildings were gray, the people were gray, they wore gray uniforms. That wasn't my thing. I wanted something happy and light, and I like the water. And so I focused on the Naval Academy, but again, that was a political process. But my father found out that the United States Coast Guard Academy was strictly competitive. There were no political appointments. And he knew because of my background and my schooling and my education that I could apply directly and perhaps get selected.
Were you interested in that? I mean, your dad is pretty much saying you need to go here. Were you going along with that, or is it you didn't have a choice? Or?
I had a choice somewhat, but I knew financially it was a smart decision to go to anything with U.S. I knew that my parents were supportive of whatever I chose, but I knew I was well disciplined as a child. I saw what the military was bringing to my brother's life, so I wanted something similar. But I walked in the shadow of my brother in many things. I wanted my own spotlight, and so I thought if I chose something different, I could get into West Point, but I didn't want to be the brother. So I chose the opposite. And I did apply for the Naval Academy, and because of the non-competitive, the non-political competitiveness of the Coast Guard, and the missions were different. And so the Navy was war, and the Coast Guard was fun, humanitarian. It had a lot less missions than it does currently, but it had missions that I could wrap around. I wanted to save lives. I like boating recreation. I wanted to do those kinds of things. And so I did apply to the Naval Academy, and only got the political appointment after physically I had chosen to go to the Coast Guard Academy. I was accepted. I remember the envelope coming to my home from the Coast Guard Academy, and my father bringing it to me and asking me to open it, but it looked like it had already been opened and sort of refolded. I could see the moisture marks. Anyway, I was selected and chose that because the mission seemed different, and I knew that nobody else in the family could say that they knew about it. It was going to be my thing.
What was your dad's reaction to getting in? Well, first of all, what was your dad's reaction that you got accepted to the Navy, but you chose the Coast Guard?
My dad was proud. He was proud of both, but he thought the Coast Guard was a better fit for me and my personality. And the Coast Guard Academy, the largest class at the time was into the 400, and the largest class at Annapolis was 1,200 in each class. And so it was a better fit. It was a good school, and it was a smaller atmosphere. So he thought I would thrive better, which he was right.
What age are we talking about now that you got the letter?
18.
Okay, so you're 18. All right, so now you get the letter. Walk us through what happened next. You're already out of high school, obviously.
I'm in high school when I got the letter.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
Let's
so
walk us through that.
okay, so quite interesting. You get these nominations and the political system and whatever. Back then, you got them all between March and May of your senior year when you graduated. And so there wasn't much time to react. Times are different now. You know, you get notified before Christmas, maybe a year early. This was sort of a thing. And so I had to make a decision, and I couldn't. There was a deadline date. I'll say it was April 1st, but I don't really remember. And so making the decision, sorry, Annapolis, yes, Coast Guard, I was all set. But my high school graduation wasn't until June 5th, and I had to report before July 5th to the Coast Guard Academy. All my friends were talking about what they were going to do all summer, and I sort of was already in the future, which that was weighing heavy on me. So I tried to cram as much fun into 3 weeks as I thought I could. And remember, my dad was the chief of police, so there was nothing funny about the fun that I crammed in. But it was trips to the lake and outings with friends and stuff. And then boom, my high school career was over, and I was all in the Coast Guard. And so as I started at the Coast Guard Academy, that fateful day where your parents bring you in and drop you off, and 4 hours later, they see you sworn in a uniform marching, I felt right away like I was missing summer with my friends. What did I do? And they called it indoctrination, but it truly was a sort of gutting of oneself and rebuilding with information and behavioral patterns that I was not familiar with. And I thought I grew up in a strong, strict home.
Is this the equivalent, the Coast Guard equivalent of boot camp?
It is boot
Okay,
camp.
so indoctrination is what they called it.
It is boot camp.
All right, now this is important because I've gone through many, many interviews with guys that went through boot camp, but I've never done one with indoctrination. So
Okay.
give us some details. You say your parents dropped you off.
My parents dropped me off at the front of Chase Hall, which was a processing building, and immediately I was formed
Still in
into.
New Jersey?
I'm sorry, dropped me off at the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. Okay, drove up, and once I got out of the car, I was the Coast Guard. Somebody came to the door, let me out, said, your parents will be taken care of, and my parents left, and they directed my parents to a day program, and I was met up X-Ray 3 was the name of my company, and there was other people lined up. We were told not to speak, and then we started in the process. And the process was walked into a hallway, and every room was something different. They measured my head. Boom, I had a cap, a sailor cap, a white sailor cap with a blue stripe. Boom, next I was in a white sailor top, and they measured my chest. And the next was pants, and they didn't fit properly, but that's what they put on. Next was shoes. Sit down, what is comfortable. Remember, you have to wear heavy white socks with it, and you're going to get blisters. Then it was haircut time. So now I was really dressed, and we were only allowed to bring underwear and a toothbrush and toothpaste with us to report in, and I was wondering about where they were going to go, meanwhile, I was standing in line to get my head shaved. And you couldn't smile. You didn't smile because you were scared. And then from there, we went into another holding courtyard, if you will, formed up, and we were soon taught how to march in a line for this swearing-in ceremony that was going to happen a couple hours later.
This is left, right, left, right, left, right. Hey, you're...
Left, right. When you turn, how to turn. And the whole time I'm thinking, my friends are at the beach. What did I do? Is it too late? Where are my parents? I was having high anxiety, and I looked around and nobody was familiar. You didn't know where they were from. You didn't even know their names yet. They were just in your group. And before I know it, that day passed quickly until 5 o'clock, and it was a ceremony that we marched in front of this Chase Hall, which is a huge administration building, on grass, turned to stop and face. Must have looked like a comedy of errors, and then we saw our parents all in the stands facing up. We had to raise our right hand and swear allegiance to the United States government and the United States Coast Guard. And I'm trying to make eye contact with my parents without standing waving my hand so they could see me, scared as anything. And at the end of the swearing-in process, they didn't make us remarch. They let us fall out, which meant we could run and kiss our parents goodbye, and we had 5 minutes to do that. And that was my first day. And as fate and luck would have it, years later, I became an officer in charge of that day. And there's no way to make it less traumatizing than it already was. So the format pretty much stood the test of time. But that was my introduction into the Coast Guard. And when I say indoctrination, immediately they gave us a book called The Running Light, and it was filled with things we had to memorize. So the first thing we had to memorize really was the mission. And then in that book were ranks and rates and how you eat and where you sit. And piece by piece, we were told to memorize that through the day, through the week, through the month, and as time progressed during the summer. And there were only cadets that were older than us in charge. They were 2 years ahead of us in charge of our group. And then there were officers in charge of them. So it was a very focused, narrow collection. We started with running in the morning at Reveille. And
Well, let's walk through. In boot camp and movies, obviously,
yes,
you get some guy with that hat coming in there banging on, waking you up and, get out, maggots, get out of here. What was the Coast Guard experience like in the morning? You've gone to sleep now, the first morning.
right. The first morning, I don't remember sleeping much, but the first morning was Reveille and very much loud sound effects, people knocking on the doors. You better be up, you better be dressed. You have 5 minutes. 5 minutes to do what? Do you take a shower now, or did you have to take it the night before? I didn't know, and it was certainly on trial by error, because if you did something that they didn't like, everybody in your group was penalized. So now, I didn't even really know how to put on the uniform again because somebody dressed me the first time. Now I had to figure out how to went back on. I had to take a shower. I needed to brush my teeth. I didn't know if I was allowed to shave, or we came back to that. Everything was new.
And everybody else was just as confused as you.
Everybody was as confused as I was, and all we could hear was screaming outside our door. You've got 5, you've got 4, I want you up here and braced against the bulkhead, which meant you were standing against the wall with there was no air behind you. You had to physically press your flesh against that wall in order to stand up straight and be appropriate. And then through the day we had a process
Now you're up against the wall.
Right.
They're banging on the outside. Did somebody come in?
So no, we're called out of our rooms.
Okay.
So we're all in a hallway against outside our rooms. And then we were told in a very directive manner, meaning screaming in our face. And these are second-class cadets now. These are cadets
They've been through this.
2 years
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
They were now in charge, telling us that we will do this. Tomorrow, it needs to be quicker. You need to take a shower the night before.
Now you tell me.
Right. You have toothpaste on your ear. This is not how we dress. The belt buckle has a smudge from your thumb. And really, the days blended together after that. We had a running exercise in the morning as a group, a fitness portion, if you will. Then we started classes. And when I say indoctrination, it was done by class sometimes. One was a Coast Guard history class. One was a military etiquette class, protocol. One was some basic rules about the physical presence of the academy. If you don't feel good, what you have to do to let somebody else know that, those kinds of things. And it jumbled into my summer experience.
Sure. How fit were you when you went in?
I was a cross-country runner
Okay.
and a track runner, and my track season was over a week before I had to, so I would say physically fit, certainly, but I maybe weighed 10 pounds. I was a tall, gangly runner. I didn't have upper body strength, which really came to be a detriment as we did the obstacle course later on during the summer. We had to climb up a rope and go to the top and ring a bell. I could get my hands around the rope, but I didn't know what was next, and I couldn't pull myself. I was not famous for upper body, but, I could run for days and be okay.
Was there any kind of camaraderie after all that was over with the group? Or you started to get to know the guys?
So yes. And, looking back now, I can't remember how it all, but we then had to memorize who was in and where they were from. And then we kept changing roommates. There was always 2 people in a room, but they changed them out. So you got to know that Chris was from Dayton, Ohio. I never even heard of Dayton, Ohio. And then somebody was from Arizona. I'm like, why would somebody from Arizona come to the Coast Guard Academy? I didn't know where there was water in Arizona. How? So you got to, and people's personalities were very strong because we were all trying to prove that we could do it. But, personalities are personalities, and then there were show-offs. And if the show-offs did something that wasn't right, everybody else had to do push-ups on the spot. So I was building upper body strength, but not the fun way, not on my own terms, certainly. And you did get to know everybody very quickly, but that also made you not like some very quickly because their actions might have been have significant effect on me.
I don't know if this is the correct term, but I think you'll understand it. Were there people that washed out eventually?
Washed out is a good term, yes. Yeah, rather quickly. Before we marched and swore, we saw people leave to say, you know what, my parents are still here, goodbye. So washed out meant that they didn't complete any part of the program. And that happened all the time. That happened through the summer. And what was sort of painful to me was I finally experienced a roommate that I liked, talked to him, knew that, hey, at least I got a buddy here and whatever. And then 2 days later, didn't know where they were. And they had left.
So we had just finished talking about the washing out process. You've gone through the first summer, right? So let's work on from there. What happened next after you got through your first summer?
So the first summer was really tough, but I look forward to the next summer because it meant that we were going to go on adventures. And that was part of the draw to the Coast Guard Academy, because during the summers, they promised you'd see the world. It also was good timing because my brother graduated from West Point, and I was able to attend his graduation in my uniform because it worked out with my assignment. So the first summer, I was on a large Coast Guard cutter that toured the Great Lakes. And it was the first time I had ever been to Grand Haven, Michigan. And that became significant later on. But
Roughly what year was this?
so that was 72,
Okay.
the summer of 72. And that was a lot of hard work, but I went to places I never heard of that were exciting. I went to Ogdensburg, New York. I went to Chicago. I went to Milwaukee. And when we arrived on these ships, we were there for big events. The Milwaukee Beer Festival was one of them. We came to Grand Haven for the Grand Haven Coast Guard Festival. So, yes, it was just amazing kinds of things. And associated with these things were duties, if you will, that we had to perform as cadets. So we had to look good, but I didn't mind being an escort in the Miss Coast Guard pageant in Coast Guard City during my time in Grand Haven. I didn't mind sampling beer as a guest at the Milwaukee Beer Festival. It was really fun. Cleveland, Ohio. And I remember Cleveland, Ohio stood out because Billy Graham was doing a crusade, an open crusade in Cleveland. And I knew who Billy Graham was, but I didn't know what a crusade was. And it was like an amazing experience. And so that summer, again, rushed by quickly. And there's 3 weeks where you're allowed to be with family. So my vacation was blended with some great experiences there. And then, boom, you're in school in August again.
Let me just go backtrack through two things. One, you're on a ship, but you're a cadet. What were you supposed to do on there? I mean, you're not feeding coal into the steamship or something. What were you doing?
No, on a ship during that, we were training. So
Okay.
we would go on watch, and we would follow around an enlisted person who was assigned to the ship, and we would do a watch. So we would do whatever they did. Sometimes it was emptying trash. Many times it was wiping up oil in the engine room. A lot of times it was reporting on some manual or mechanical configurations that were required hourly for the safety of the ship.
Now you're not wearing dress whites.
We're not wearing dress whites. We're not wearing anything that's white. We're wearing really chambray shirts, which like blue bell-bottom dungarees and
style, at least.
and a blue chambray shirt, much like that they wore in the South Pacific movie / Broadway show. I mean, and that was my frame of reference, or that I saw my dad's picture in. So that was kind of cool, but working clothes.
What's interesting is that as cadets, they're making you see exactly what everybody on the ship is doing.
Absolutely. From the ground up, there was no job that was too dirty for a cadet to do. And in fact, I think they saved some just for us. And you have to picture that the enlisted men on the ship, and I say men because there were only men, were saving some things that probably they never would do themselves, but they had some extra help, and it was me. So it was a learning experience. You learned something different every day in a different place, and then you rotated watches. So depending on the kind of ship, you might have been doing drills on a small boat, which was awful, a larger ship, and doing inspections of the hull, or you might have been in the engine room, or you could be on the bridge learning how to drive the ship or navigate to the next part. Or at night you could be shooting the stars, learning a lot. It was really a movable classroom all during the summer.
That's perfect. Let's go back to the getting a chance to take some time off with the family, okay? Your father now has a son that graduated from West Point.
Right.
You're a cadet. What was this like? Coming home, come on, you had to be feeling proud of yourself.
Absolutely. I was thrilled to come home to do nothing. All of a sudden, hey, why don't we do this? Let's go see. I'm like, no, I'm pretty much good. All I want to do is sleep. And if you could make those pancakes that you always made, I would really love that. And to remember that corned beef that I really hated, I sort of would like that again. So I came home to be quiet. And it was just a great family time to visit with my brother and sisters and really do nothing. They were pulling more energy out of me. What did you do? How did you do this? What did you think? And yeah, it was all good. I just want to sleep.
Your dad must have understood that, though.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, he did. And you have to, my dad was so proud. Every different experience I had, wherever I was, and that started when I was a cadet, he needed a hat. He needed a ball cap that says what it was that I was doing, so he could wear it and everybody could ask him about it, and he could talk about it. And the Coast Guard had a lot more hats than the Army. And so I, even if I was just visiting a friend who was on a ship that had a hat, I would get a hat and send it to my father. So I quickly became the Army stories of my brother sort of trailed off, and the Coast Guard stories took main stage.
So how did you, during that period of time, obviously the focus was on survival, just getting through each day and making sure you're doing everything you're supposed to do, which is what they're training you to do. But do you have a better idea what was going on in the world around you?
Yes, I was more aware because now physically when I was at the academy and my brother had just graduated, the war in Vietnam was officially ended. That didn't mean that there weren't still assignments there. And the Coast Guard was proud to toot its horn and say that the Coast Guard was involved in Vietnam on patrol boats, etc., which to me was very surprising because I thought the Coast Guard that I was signing up for was homebound. Not so true. So that was the first sort of recollection that I had, that the Coast Guard had some more worldly duties, some more global missions that I just never was aware of. And yes, I took more interest in the world around me because once I understood that the Coast Guard goes anywhere, now I was on ships that were doing fisheries patrols in international waters. And we were interacting and reacting with other countries. And so now I had more interest when I read somebody said something from somewhere because I'm thinking it might affect me some way. And I was in the service now. I was part of that. And I could be going there, perhaps. So yes.
So as you move forward, how many years, what was the period of time, let me rephrase that, what was the period of time of your cadet before you actually graduated?
And the academy is a 4-year educational program where you graduate with a degree, and my degree was in history and government. And so
You had
it's
a choice?
history/government. You had a choice based on availability, a number of slots, and I knew that I didn't want to be a mechanical engineer. I knew that I really didn't want to be in naval engineering, and then there was electrical engineering, lots of heavy engineering because it was an engineering school, but I knew that I would do better with humanitarian courses that I thought humanitarian, like English and government and history. And those were the things that I was most interested in anyway.
And
So
you took tests and whatnot,
I
right? So,
took
yeah.
tests,
Right.
and then a certain percentage of your class could go into this major, et cetera. And it worked out. I wasn't in economics and accounting, but I wasn't interested in that. So for me, that worked out.
So you're there from 72 to 76?
I came in 71,
Oh, 71,
the
okay.
summer of
That's right,
71.
That's right, 'cause I'm 70, okay.
And added 4. So I graduated on a glorious day in June of 1975.
Okay, so yeah, because I got out in college in 76, because you're 1 year, correct?
Right.
All right, now I got the framework, okay.
Right, I'm much older.
You're, yeah, right, not by much. So, what was graduation day like?
It was everything I wanted it to be and more. We had already seen my brother's graduation at West Point. My brother was uber smart, and they don't read your name at the military academy in order of where you graduated in the class. It's alphabetical. He had 1,200 guys in his class, and by the time he got to Smith, I couldn't even remember what day it was, and we had to sit there in the sun. So I'm like, oh, wow. At the Coast Guard Academy, it was your military score and your academic score. And for me, my military score was high. I did well in the environment and leadership, etc. Academic, not so much. So when we blended the two together, let's just say the graduation at the Coast Guard Academy is on the football field. And it's the dignitaries on a stage, in chairs, the graduates, and then the football stand behind you was filled with guests and parents. From where I sat at graduation, I could hold hands with my folks up in the bleachers. So I wasn't near the front of the class, is what I'm saying. But didn't matter. The last one or the first one, the moment of pride to know that I achieved completing the course and now ready to go to the Coast Guard was phenomenal. It was a big deal for everybody that knew me, related to me, friends, and most importantly, me.
Did you know where you were going from there?
Yes, when you're a first-class cadet in your senior year, a firstie, you compete for billets based on, again, that old academic and military. And you take your card and all the available ships and assignments, and at that point, there were only ships. When you graduated from the Coast Guard Academy, at that time, you had to go on a ship. So there were all the ships available. And the brightest, smartest military guy put number 1 on a small boat in Honolulu. Okay? That happened through the night. And when it came to me, there was a large ship in New York Harbor available for 8 of my classmates. And there were 3 ships in Alaska. 2 in Kodiak and 1 in Aide. And I took my card and put it in Kodiak, Alaska, because one, never been there before. Two, I felt like if I picked a ship with lots of my classmates, we'd be competing against each other as ensigns. I wanted a chance to do my own thing and shine. So I picked a smaller ship in Kodiak. Best choice I could have made. So I knew then in March, April, when I graduated, where I was going. But I had another opportunity. After I graduated in June, they said, well, you can have 2 weeks off with your family if you want, but how would you like to be a summer ensign? So you would be in charge of the second-class cadets who are in charge of the new cadets coming in. So to me, that
You have to yell?
yeah, to me,
sorry, I'm sorry.
to me that appealed to me because I was going to Alaska soon, but this gave me a summer in Connecticut near my parents, near my family. So that extended my time with my family during the summer. And it was also a job that I had some experience at a lower level with that I thought I would enjoy, and I did. So I wasn't reporting to Kodiak, Alaska until late August, and as it turned in September. And therein starts a flurry of stories with my first assignment.
What was your first assignment?
My first assignment was a deck watch officer, meaning a general purpose officer, on the Storis, which was an icebreaker, excuse me, my first assignment was on the Storis, which was a one-of-a-kind icebreaker / buoy tender. And the Storis means blue ice. And so that should have been a hint that I was going to get really cold really fast. But because I was delayed getting to my ship because I did the summer program as a summer ensign, I arrived quickly to the ship to be told that we were deploying the next day. My luggage hadn't arrived yet. And by luggage, I mean every uniform, my underwear, my ditty bag filled with shaving stuff. I traveled to Kodiak with just a little thing, but I had to go overnight in Anchorage before I got that little plane to Kodiak. My luggage never made it, and the ship was leaving. So I reported on board the ship, and then we left. So I had to borrow uniforms, underwear, clothes from other junior officers on board the ship. And the ship went on a 30-day deployment to Prudhoe Bay because there were some 46 barges loaded with equipment, bringing him to Prudhoe Bay to establish a U.S. presence there and help out the refinery, that the oil pipeline, and they were essentially building a city. And all these barges were stuck in the ice. We on the Storis had to go up there, ram the ice, and let them get through. So talk about being uncomfortable in your own setting. I was uncomfortable in somebody else's underwear. However, that experience was incredible because I wasn't the only ship going up there. And now I was a deck watch officer on a watch at night, talking to the other ships. And guess who was on the other ships? My classmates. So I was talking professionally now to people I had just graduated with, and we were all doing the same mission. The mission was successful. We got stuck. I saw polar bears. The ice was incredible. We got a presidential citation for our work there. My unit did. So my first 30 days, I got a medal. I mean, I thought that was so cool. I really would have preferred my own underwear, again, instead of the medal at the time, but eventually I got over that.
I'm trying to get the timing here. Who was the president at that time?
1975.
Oh, that would have been,
Uh,
right?
I don't remember.
That's all right. Yeah, neither one of us remember.
Wait, yeah, and we're both historians.
That's
Okay, well, whatever. It was that guy.
That was that guy, that's
Yeah,
right, yeah.
I know who it wasn't. Really cool. Just a great.
That's right, Nixon would have been before that, so it doesn't matter. Cut, go ahead, go ahead.
Then we came back to the port of Kodiak, and now I was away from home, but Kodiak base was big. And Kodiak was still rural at the time. They had one store, about 11 miles, I think, from where the base was, and it was a general store. So they had like one cassette. They had like 3 bottles of shampoo and 1 tire. I mean, they covered everything, but it was rural. You'd have to get a ride in there. So anyway, it was a unique experience, let's just say. And because I came from a city right outside New York City, I was a big city guy in a very rural area. So that brought with it some adjustments in environment and cool, but I wasn't a hunter. I never fished before. So I was seeing things and learning things, and to get along, you sort of go with the flow. So I did that. One of the most impressive things to me, though, was now I was an adult in an adult job. I was in charge of people, and I was living in an environment that brought with it its own set of limitations. In Kodiak, there were more bars than there were stores. And so alcoholism was prevalent with both shipmates and citizens. As a young college graduate, that wasn't the experience that I was hoping to see or knowing that I was going to be experiencing. So that became more prevalent as I was faced with decisions as a leader about the men that I was working with, et cetera. So I grew up very quickly there.
You're talking about having to discipline people because of their bad behavior, that sort of thing?
Right, both on and off the ship.
Right.
And I lived on the ship. I had no house on the base. That was for people that had families. So I was 24/7 with the people that I worked with. And it's hard to separate when you're on duty on the ship and then you're off duty at a place and the same people. And you know that if you're in a bar at 3 a.m. and you're leaving yourself, and the next morning your ship gets called out at 7, and those folks that you saw are just coming back on board from being out all night, you know it's going to be a long day.
Yeah. And you're in your early 20s by this time.
I am only 22 years old.
Yeah, sure, and with that kind of responsibility.
Right. With no previous strong leadership, and I'm leading people who have been in the service 15 years and who come from different backgrounds, whose work ethics are different, whose value systems are different. So it was my big boy first job.
There had to be, you had superiors, right?
I did.
Yeah, I mean, you had to do things, but at the same time, your responsibility was more ground level. If there any major discipline, somebody did something really bad, there's nothing you can do about it. That's somebody else had to deal with that. Or is that accurate?
That's fairly accurate, except I had to identify it. So I was the one that experienced the effects of alcoholism first because of non-performance of duty or because I could smell it, see it, or otherwise. So I had to make decisions about how I was to handle it. And I was limited in my ability to fix it. So I had to then forward it up the chain. And I had to remember that I was still going to be living with this guy no matter what I recommended. So I wasn't going to be the most favorite person on board his ship, and he had been there way before me.
And for a young man who had already experienced this pride in your work, seeing that kind of behavior from people who you would not be 15 years later, but you could see there are people that went through what you went through, and 15 years later, this is what they're doing. This is not exactly the path that you said you were going to go or were planning
Right,
to do.
that wasn't in my little book to memorize.
Yeah, right.
You know, they didn't say, oh, by the way, be ready for. Pretty much it said, here's your book and good luck. And so that was, many of these folks were not the kind of people I was used to being around. And at the Coast Guard Academy, sort of by the time you graduated, everybody looked the same, acted the same, dressed the same. That wasn't true anymore. And so it was a whole new world.
Looking back on it, this is going to be a tough question, but how do you rate how you did?
I'll rate it in terms of what happened next, because I wouldn't have gotten selected to be the commanding officer of my own patrol boat next had I screwed up first. And I owe it not only to sort of the support that I got at home, encouraging me to just dive into everything and get involved, and I was living on the ship so I couldn't get away, but to the mentors that I had on this ship, because many of them were in the same circumstance, but they were older. We were going on patrols, but they left their family behind. And they had an opportunity to mentor me to be the kind of officer they wanted me to be, and they thought that they were. And I'm forever grateful. I was experiencing things other people on their ships did not. And while it was scary, and I didn't really like it at the time, it helped me then form a path for success that kept building on that first experience.
So you got orders to go somewhere else.
Yes.
What was your reaction?
Well, I wanted to go to flight school, and I couldn't pass the spatial aperture test, diving, bombing, banking, right or left. You sat in a classroom and took the test. I couldn't do that. Even though on my free weekends, Kodiak was also an air base, and I would fly with the pilots on my off time all through over Alaska. We'd spot bear, Kodiak brown bear. Some would go back and hunt them later on. But I flew because I wanted to get that experience, but I never passed the test. And it's okay, because they said, okay, if you can't be a pilot, what do you want to be? So I said, you know what, I can take that test later anyway again. But I'd like something like command of my own patrol boat. I was selected for command of my own patrol boat, and it happened to be in Sandy Hook, New Jersey, less than 2 hours from my home, in New York Harbor, as a 24-year-old. So it was a big deal, and it was really cool. And I was ready to go from Alaska to home.
So what was that experience like? What do you have to do to be, I mean, I don't know. How do you become a commander of a boat in New York Harbor?
And you did search and rescue, and it was an 82-foot long. So it was quite manageable. Had a crew of 6, and we did search and rescue. If it was bad weather, we went out. That didn't sit so well with my system, if you will, but nobody else's either. But it gave a strong sense of immediate response and pride, if you will. And there was sadness and disappointment. Some of our rescues turned into recoveries, and that meant that the person or the property was deceased or beat up bad. So there
By
was
the storm.
So yeah, by the storm and by the circumstances, whether it was poor judgment or whatever. So I saw a lot of that. So that experience was enlightening. We did drug interdiction. We did a lot of different marine environmental protection. But weirdly enough, my patrol boat in New Jersey was selected to be the escort for the America's Cup races held in Newport, Rhode Island. And I knew enough about Newport, Rhode Island and the America's Cup race to know that it was the most prestigious water event internationally, but it was called the America's Cup race, and we owned the cup. So I was selected to bring my crew and my patrol boat way up to Rhode Island, and as it turned out, they assigned me, once I got there, to very specifically escort the Courageous, which was a challenger that year, and the owner of the Courageous and the captain was Ted Turner of the Ted Turner Broadcast Network, of Ted Turner, the
Classics.
everything.
Yeah.
And it was an experience beyond comprehension. My duties were pretty shallow. I had to fill my patrol boat up with media and escort the Courageous out and stand at a turning point during the procedure of the races. And everybody took pictures and whatever, escort the Courageous back in every day of the races. And the Courageous won. And the most and biggest and brightest recollection of that whole series of races was the triumphant Courageous coming in, and immediately they did a press conference. And Ted Turner had been celebrating so much en route, and I don't know where they kept champagne on the Courageous during the race, that he had to be carried onto the platform and seated in the chair for the press conference. He was so exhilarated / inebriated. And that was part of what I did. And the cover of Sports Illustrated magazine in September of 1977 was taken from my patrol boat. So cool. The Australians were the challengers, cool people, loved to party. I was dating someone at the time. She worked in New York City, would come up every day to Rhode Island and stay for the race and then go back to work. It was just an amazing experience.
I, of course, of the age to remember that, because that was a big tournament. The Turner was not only very flamboyant, but who'd have thought that he could win?
Right.
And that
He was a very seasoned professional
Yeah.
on the water.
Yeah. And it launched him, really. That really launched him into superstardom, which eventually got him into all those other areas that
Correct.
became Ted Turner as he is today.
Right.
That was the moment, and you were there.
Well, for me, the excitement part was now, as history would have it, the America's Cup race is not in America routinely. And the cast of characters now become more corporate. Back then, it was really a personality. And I'm thrilled to say I knew that personality.
So once you went from there, where was your next assignment?
From the patrol boat, I was selected to go back to the Coast Guard Academy as a company officer in charge of the discipline and administrative piece for 120 cadets.
Why? I mean, I'm asking this as somebody from the military, but why?
Why would I want to go there?
Why would you assign there?
Why would I be assigned there?
Yeah.
Well, because it's important for cadets to know that there is an afterlife there. And really, it's like being on your alma mater faculty. And so that was prestigious. There were only, I forget how many companies there were, but there was a very limited number of companies, I'll say 8 to 10. So it was prestigious within the Coast Guard to be asked to be a company officer. So I had to go to a course in Yorktown, so I wasn't there right away. But then I went and started at the academy in the summer. While I was at the academy as a company officer in charge of these company of cadets, and there were all the 4 classes, and there I traveled in the summer with some of the cadets, being their supervisor, if you will. I went to Puerto Rico and Bermuda. But collaterally, I was asked, because of my interest, I think, in public affairs, and I did other things as a company officer that related to the academy as a whole, I was asked to be the aide to the superintendent. And the superintendent is the president of the university. He was a rear admiral. So I said yes, and I did that and developed a relationship with the superintendent and his wife and their family, and that took me to the next step. So in that duty as the aide to the superintendent, they across the river, not even a mile, was the Boatworks electric boat and the sub, and they dedicated the John Glenn. So the Vice President of the United States came, and John Glenn, and my boss was the host, so I got to write the speech for him and got to be over there and meet Admiral Rickover and John Glenn and the Vice President. It was very cool. Lots of fun experiences like that. So now I'm supposed to be a company officer for 3 years, but the superintendent at the Coast Guard Academy just got promoted to a 3-star, to a vice admiral. And he was asked to be the Pacific Area Commander in San Francisco. And so he got his orders and said he was off. And then he said to me, "Would you like to be the aide to the Pacific Area Commander?" And I said, "Let me ask my wife, but hell yeah." And so it was. My wife acknowledged we could leave because I got a wife while I was stationed at the academy. I neglected to mention that, who was from that area. And we went to San Francisco, and I became the aide, full-time job to the Pacific Area Commander. And in that job, I did everything from write speeches to planned itineraries, to travel to Antarctica twice, to travel to small islands I never heard of for reasons I'm still not sure, but national security was involved. I saw cultures I never knew existed or hadn't read about in Yap and Kwajalein and Johnston Atoll, barely being able to land in an aircraft, in our own aircraft, and then doing jobs there, traveling around the Far East, speaking at embassies. It was an experience of a lifetime. Met people I never thought I would meet. The Admiral was the senior military presence in San Francisco. Previously, it had been a naval officer, but they were downsizing Alameda. So he became the big cheese. So the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, announced that he was going to host the state dinner, not in Washington, D.C., and the state visit for the Queen of England. He was going to host it in San Francisco because she was going to arrive on Britannia, the royal yacht. And all of a sudden now, I'm working on the state dinner, the state visit of the Queen of England. And it was amazing, just amazing. Every piece of that was amazing, from the dinners to the events, to the shows, to the breakfast. The funniest recollection of that was there were 30 people invited to a breakfast before a show in the Davies Symphony Hall for the Queen. And as you might imagine, there were thousands of people invited to that. So 30 people. So the admiral was the senior military host protecting Britannia, et cetera, et cetera. So he was invited with his wife. So I said, wow, I'd really sort of like to go to that breakfast. He said, well, you can get in, you can go. So we were dressed in our formal gear. I have the agilette with the gold, looked just like I worked on the Britannia, actually. And I held the admiral's invitation, which came in a box, in my hand, presented it at the breakfast, and said, I'm pleased to introduce Vice Admiral Mrs. Charles E. Larkin, Jr. And they said, welcome. And he put his arm on my back and ushered me in. And now I was in the breakfast. So I'm not a participant because at the breakfast are celebrities, the mayor, Dianne Feinstein, 30 people. And I'm standing off to the side as they sit down for breakfast. I'm in the room, but I know I wasn't going to sit and have crumpets. So I didn't realize it, but I was standing in front of portraits in the room. And up comes this man who looks familiar, and he said, oh, you moved. And I said, well, yes, I moved. He said, I thought you were part of the picture. And then I looked behind him, his picture posed and whatever. And he said, I said, oh, no, I'm here with the admiral. He said, oh, cool. And it was Robin Williams with his very pregnant wife, Valerie, at the time, who moved in and out of character while he said that. Like the character that you see, like the sounds and whatever. So it was really, whoa, Robin Williams spoke to me. And as years would progress, of course, he became more famous. And I was pulled back to that story when he passed because it, to me, showed he was never out of character. His personality was a multitude of people. And I think pretty much that was one of his mental issues. And I'm not a doctor, but it became apparent that his personality was multi-layered.
Yeah.
So that was my connecting piece.
Wow. So I'm speechless. I'm drawn back to your original statement when we first started this interview about how you wanted to get in the Coast Guard because it would allow you to get into all these different places. You had no clue it would be this amount of people, this amount of places.
I never read that the Coast Guard did the things that I was doing.
Yeah, right.
I never thought I would be exposed to those kinds of things. I never knew that I would be involved in 5 presidential or inaugural committees, whether it was with cadets or as the person assigning celebrities to Coast Guard and other service escorts. I never thought of the Coast Guard like that. I didn't know that I would go to Antarctica. I had heard it, that there was an Antarctica, but I didn't know why the Coast Guard would be there. I didn't know. I had no idea. And honestly, I have talked to lots of my peers and brother-in-law that's a retired Rear Admiral from the Coast Guard now. His experiences were equally unique, but not like mine. So now I have a nephew that's a Coast Guard rescue pilot. He's in Washington, D.C. And, you know, he was amazed because one of his duty stations was a Kodiak. And we can't even compare apples to apples because there's apples and oranges now. Even the setting is different. But the Coast Guard, I just never knew it was this diverse.
Mike, we're running out of time here, but I do want to get your agreement that we're going to continue this interview again. There's more to talk about, obviously.
Yep.
But I think at this stage right now, I've reached a point where I think I need to ask you this question. and then this will not be the end of, that'll be the end of this particular
Yeah.
interview, but we're gonna do another one if you agree to that. So looking back on it now, how did, and there's just so many experiences that you haven't even talked about yet, but how did those experiences, that 18-year-old kid, that path that went in, how did it get to the person, how did it influence the person that you are today?
Everything about my path in the Coast Guard has added to who I am today. Starting with the value system, starting with that little running light book of indoctrination and memorization, being good with names and protocol, up to and including the ability to work with men and women whose values were different but whose mission was the same, and processing that. And I wasn't really sure if it would ever come to a point and peak, and I could say sort of that was the defining moment. But on September 28th of this past year, I received the Spirit of Hope Award at the Pentagon, and it was named after Bob Hope for his style and humanitarian service and selfless action. And for me, all those experiences that we just talked about now have a name, and I think I got there.
But the interesting thing is that you may have gotten there, but the Coast Guard hasn't let go of you yet, because what is your current position here in Grand Haven?
Well, I think all those were prep for, I'm the executive director of the Grand Haven Coast Guard Festival. And with it, the mission of the festival is to honor, respect, and salute the men and women of the United States Coast Guard. I've done that from the moment that I said I would go in, and I will love that to the triangularly folded American flag when I pass. Every experience has made me embrace that love, respect, and honor, and this job lets me share it with others.